Let's convene the Board Governance Committee this morning. Let's see. So I guess the first item, do we do a roll call? Should we do a roll call? Okay. Gwen, good morning.
Mr. Juarez, representing the State Treasurer.
Steve Juarez for State Treasurer John Chung.
Mr. Rosensteel.
Here.
Ms. Higa.
Here.
Ms. Yamamoto.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Ms. Vargas. Ms. Wong Hernandez, representing the Director of Finance. Chairperson Yi, you have quorum.
Thank you very much. All right. Our first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda and the work plan. Any objection to agenda or work plan? Okay. Item number 2 is approval of the minutes from the November 2nd, 2017 Board Governance Committee meeting. Okay. Approved by Ms. Hendricks, second by Ms. Yamamoto, without objection. Yes, Ms. Vargas? You abstain? Okay. Those minutes are approved, noting Ms. Vargas abstaining. All right, item number 3 relates to routine reports and actions of board policy. This is a second reading of the policy, and let me have Jill, if you want to present the item.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So this is being brought back to add just a couple I did.
Is that one not working?
Yeah.
It's the one between. Okay. You weren't talking so loud there.
Oh, I'm too loud?
No, you weren't very loud.
Oh.
Be louder.
Okay. So this is the routine reports and actions of the board policy that is being brought back for another review. There were a couple things that were added based upon the committee's input from the last meeting. Those are noted in red on BGov 9. And those were basically the addition of a provision stating the executive office will provide notification to the board when there are revisions to the report listing. And then also that the board may make revisions to the report listing periodically as needed. And those were basically the only additions to the policy, like I said, based on the committee input from the last meeting. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Any questions or comments, members? Okay, hearing none. This is on second reading, so a motion would be in order. Okay, motion by Ms. Hendricks to approve the policy. Second by Ms. Higa? Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Vargas. I heard a voice. Okay. By Ms. Vargas, without objection. Great, the policy is approved. Thank you. Item number 4 is the policy related to consultant evaluation. This is also on second reading. Ms. McDuffie? Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
And this is a similar script, if you will, to what Jill just talked about with the routine report policy. So the committee reviewed the consultant evaluation policy in November, and there was a clarification that was requested. And that is actually in the top of UGAD 12. There's an additional sentence section added. Essentially, to the effect that if there's any evaluation materials that are gathered in connection with the consultant evaluations, that those materials are provided to the full board of company and not just the officer. So you can see that that sentence is coming in on UGAD 12 at the very top. Other than that, there weren't any other changes that were requested, but I certainly do not get any additional comments.
Great, thanks, Amy. Questions or comments, members? Yes, Ms. Yamamoto. Karen?
Since number 5 has the orientation process for new members crossed out, where is that now?
Yeah, that's in the board education policy, actually, and I don't know the specific citation for it, but there's a section on not only the orientation itself, but the various aspects and topics that are supposed to be covered in the orientation. So that does exist. It's in another section.
So in other words, it doesn't need to be included here.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments?
I think my only other
Yes, sure.
I as vice chair of the board, I think we're always trying to tweak how we do evaluations and getting input from the entire board and making sure. We've been in a process as a board of getting more clarity about what we want from our consultants and how we evaluate them. So I just wanted to ensure and invite the board, if there's more feedback about this process, we certainly, Dana and I would like to hear it, and obviously Amy, just because I feel like it's always evolving in terms of, what we're looking for and being more specific in our feedback to our consultants. So I was pleased with how things went this past year. But I guess I just wanted to ensure everyone it's an evolving process. So if there's more input to make that process more specific and objective, I'd invite the board to give us that input.
Certainly. Madam Chair, if I could
Thank you.
respond
Yes,
quickly. I just wanted to point out two things. And first, of course, is that we welcome the feedback. We've always been under the philosophy here that we're in the relentless pursuit of best practices, if you will, to the extent it makes sense to the board and to the committee. And then secondarily, the practice that this path for the consultant evaluations has meandered to over the years is actually what's codified in the policy. So current practice is now reflective of the policy itself, and I think that's a great thing. But as it moves forward, we can certainly suggest updates. I think we have enough flexibility and latitude in here to make that work over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Okay. Other thoughts on this? Okay, hearing none. This is also on second reading, so motion is in order.
So moved.
Okay. Motion by Mr. Rosenstiel, second by Ms. Higa. Without objection, consultant evaluation policy is approved. Thank you. Okay, move on to number 5, and this is the charter revisions, also on second reading. Jill?
Thank you. So this is being brought back just for another review of, it's basically a minor change to the charter, and it's to generalize the education portion of the responsibilities in the charter. And so that's noted on BGov 15. Previously, that section was more specific to oversee the orientation process for new board members. And the revision is to broaden that or to generalize it to oversee and facilitate educational opportunities for the board.
Okay, and just to clarify, the revision doesn't preclude other committees from offering educational opportunities
Yes,
on
that's
various
accurate.
trustee topics related to that committee.
That
So,
would be accurate.
okay.
Mhm.
All right, very well. Questions, members, comments? Okay, hearing none, motion would be in order. Second by moved by Ms. Hendricks, second by Ms. Vargas. Without objection, the charter revisions are approved. Okay. Moving on to item number 6. This is our Board Education Forum, and delighted to be welcoming our guest speakers, and I'll have Amy introduce them. But we are going to focus a bit of time on just learning about leading practices and oversight by boards of major system implementations. And this has emanated from the increased focus on our pension solutions project, but thought it appropriate to bring some experts back to talk about it in a public sector context. And Amy, thank you for working with us on getting our speakers here. Would you mind introducing them?
Yes, I would. I do have a couple of comments, so thank you,
Please.
Madam Chair. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the ability and the direction to bring this focused education opportunity to the committee. I know as I, come here for meetings and for other board meetings and other meetings, that there's many, many staff inside this building that are working very, very hard on pension solutions. And what they're doing, if you think about it, is effectively creating the foundational feature and framework of the CalSTRS member and employer experience. And that's an exceptionally important endeavor, of course, which is why it's a key element in the board's strategic plan. And the project has been underway for quite some time now, and I think that makes it the perfect time really to pause and take a step back and reflect on the practices that contribute to successful board oversight of projects like these in the public sector. So to that end, it's my pleasure to introduce a team of experts from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you for being here this morning. One of whom you may remember, Barbara Berlin, presented to this committee in summer of last year, and the topic at that point was board oversight of technology in all areas. So we invited her back, and she graciously agreed to come back as we now drill into, this more focused topic. So if the committee recalls, Barbara is a director in PwC's Governance Insights Center, which is really the national clearinghouse for board best practices information. So Barbara is joined to my right by Kristen Santani, and she's a director in PwC's U.S. State and Local Advisory Practice, Government Advisory Practice, I should say, and she's also the West Region lead. So thank you, Kristen, for being here. And then Mike Shippen is the director in PwC's National Transformation Assurance Practice. So Kristen and Mike routinely work on large systems implementations in the public sector, and their full bios are in the committee in the committee materials packet. Okay.
We're going to switch over.
Okay.
Yeah,
This will work.
I think this works, hopefully.
yes, better.
Okay,
Let's turn
perfect.
these
Better.
off, so they don't create
We're gonna try this and see
feedback
if
into
it
that.
records upstairs. Okay.
But the most important priority is hearing.
Yeah.
They can live with that support.
Terrific. Thank you. So essentially, at a high level, I just wanted to lay out what they're going to cover, hopefully without stealing their thunder. But really, they're going to talk to you about how other public sector boards think about their oversight role with respect to systems implementations like this. There's certainly a wide roster of players involved in these types of projects, and so they're going to talk about those roles with a specific focus on how the board's oversight role can best be directed. They're also planning to share their experiences of best practices with other projects that they've been on, and they'll finish with offering some questions that the committee can ask of its consultants and other players, including staff, about the project and where it is. So I won't steal any more of their thunder. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning, and I'll turn it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully this is working now. Can everybody hear? Okay, great. Well, one, thank you for the opportunity to come back and meet with the board again. As Amy mentioned, I came in June with one of my colleagues, Terry Ward, and we touched on the oversight of technology. And in that, we did a very, very light touch on the oversight of system implementation. And so today, we're delighted to be joining you to share leading practices and our perspectives on this important area. And as we go through the presentation, I just want to say we welcome the questions. We want to make it interactive. We don't want to just be presenting to you. We're really here for your benefit and welcome you to ask questions as we go along. In addition, I also want to commend the board for putting these educational sessions on your agenda. It's always wonderful from a governance perspective to see organizations reaching to understand what some of the leading practices are and then taking those and bringing them to the organization that you're at. So we're delighted to be here. So with that, I'm going to ask Kristen to start kind of with the agenda and share some of our plan for the next hour.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thank you for having us.
Pull your mic over, please.
Sure. And I just wanted to say, personally, as a daughter of a school teacher, I'm excited to be here personally and also as a resident of California. So commend you on all the good work that you guys do. So happy to be here to help guide you through some best practices across public sector entities when it comes to these large-scale system implementations. So with that, we're going to start out at a high level, talk about the board's oversight role. We're then going to talk a bit around some risk areas. We're going to introduce a risk framework. So it's a big picture way to think about these big projects. And then we have a couple of areas that we're going to drill down into that we think are timely and relevant based on where you are currently with this project. So that's all within the deck materials, but what you also have that we've placed in front of you is a placemat or a booklet. And so this is just to summarize and also to help provide materials for a takeaway. And so just to orient you guys real quick, if you open the booklet, you'll see at the top left-hand portion, this is where we're talking around specifically the connection of the board role to this project. And then as you go further down the page here, there's a nice colorful image that introduces the risk framework. So it talks about the key areas around the risk controls, what are they specifically covering off, and then who is responsible and accountable for those areas. And then as we move the eye over to the other side of the booklet, that's where we'll be talking around specific highlights that we think are relevant for where you're at currently in the project. So feel free to use this as a guide. as we go through the slides, but those are the key areas. One last component is the very back page of the booklet. There are just some key questions. So when you're thinking about those risk areas as part of that framework that we'll introduce, here are some questions that a board could consider asking staff, vendors, just to make sure that we're on track on each one of those areas. So just at a high level, hopefully this will be helpful for you guys as a takeaway. So with that, my colleague, I'll pass it back over to Barbara to talk a bit around the oversight role.
And I guess before you do, I just wanted to clarify that the presentation that the board received in advance, this material is consistent, the placemat material is consistent with the presentation. So there's no new information that wasn't in the presentation.
Right, that's a quick summary. I think were we going to click here? I can go to the slides? Okay. So I think it's always helpful when you have these conversations with a board is to set the stage a bit with regard to the board's oversight role, and particularly as it relates to a major system implementation. So the board has a number of key responsibilities, which you know, in performing your role. And when I think about those key responsibilities as it relates to this system implementation, two kind of come to the surface. The first is the oversight of the company's strategic direction and plan. What are the strategic goals of the organization? Is there a clear direction? And then oversight of the company's key risks and the underlying effectiveness of that enterprise risk management program. So if I think about a major system implementation, like the one happening at CalSTRS, and I look at CalSTRS' strategic plan, one of the key goals in that strategic plan is this business transformation. So clearly with that as a key goal of the organization, it's one that should be on the board's agenda. And with the board weighing in on the strategic plan, looking to review it and approve it and add their counsel and guidance as the company moves forward with that strategic plan. In addition, when you think about it from a risk oversight and overseeing the key risks to the organization, when you're doing a major system implementation, there are key risks to be thinking about at the board level. And so when wondering whether this meets the criteria to be on the board's agenda, a board would be thinking about questions about how does this major system implementation tie to our core competency that we deliver to our customers? And in this case, it's significant. You know, as Amy said, there's a number of people within the organization creating and working to make this a successful project. In addition, as a board, one of the questions that gets raised in system implementation is, what would happen if the implementation was not successful? What's the impact of that on our customers, the impact on the organization, and on our other stakeholders? And that's a frame of reference you can use because not all things can make it to the board's agenda. But when they're significant enough, then they should be on the board's agenda. And so in the case of this system implementation, the implications of understanding the business continuity and what that means to CalSTRS, as well as the number of the high visibility of this project and the number of public eyes and stakeholders looking at the success of this project would be indicators. And finally, the question always comes up as another consideration about materiality. And materiality is one factor that you do weigh in making decisions of what comes up to the board, but you weigh them in the context of the strategic plan and oversight of the key risks to the organization. But materiality isn't a factor that you consider on its own. So I can give an example of something that many boards had on their agenda if we look back a few years to Y2K. So, Y2K was on every board's agenda, yet there were many organizations that did not have a price tag that they had to put with the system. Some had to put in new system implementations, but some it was a very small cost. But the board had it on its agenda because they wanted to be certain that as the system went to a 1/1/2000 date, that it would be working for the organization and it would help the organization with its business continuity and delivering its services. So that's why I say materiality is another factor to consider, but it isn't the only consideration. So I know this is on the board's agenda and it seems to meet the criteria to be a factor or an area for the board's attention. And so with that, I also think about from a board's oversight role, having a robust process in place underlying that to help the board, as I said, from weighing in and overseeing the strategic plan, as well as overseeing the key risks and having the underlying accountability and governance structure in place to allow the board to ensure that there's an effective process and the right people and accountability within the organization. And then tied to that, making certain that the board gets the metrics and the information it needs to help make decisions and understand what the red flags are, and then going deeper behind those red flags when they are significant. So I think it's always good to put a little bit of context around why this is an important boardroom agenda, and I thought I would lay that as the foundation. And then I'm going to actually hand it back to Kristen and Mike, where they're going to walk through that robust process at a board level.
So good morning. It falls to me to unfortunately now be the bearer of bad news. The top of this slide, you're seeing a statistic. I'm sure you've seen similar statistics before. This is from the Standish Group, that 68% of IT projects are either failures, outright failures, or they face significant challenges. And I think we've all seen headlines throughout the country, throughout the world, in terms of schedule, budget, reputational impacts. The alarming thing about these statistics is they have remained consistent for some number of decades. As an industry, in terms of IT projects, these rates are not coming down. So we wanted to provide some context why. Failure rates are indeed higher for larger, more complex projects. And certainly when you have multi-organizational, multi-stakeholder, multi-vendor environments, that complexity raises, your inherent risk rises, and you see those failure rates. And with the current program in play here, a number of those you could place a check mark next to. So why? Why are projects failing? The bottom half, you're seeing some statistics from our recent global survey. Top two reasons for project delay are changes of scope mid-project or poor estimates in planning. So you're seeing there that the failures that often become apparent later in the project, it was because of earlier issues. The top four reasons for failure, I think what's really interesting here is none of these four reasons relate specifically to an IT process. It's not issues with testing, issues with technical complexity. They're often the interpersonal aspects of projects, reprioritization of priorities within the organization, changes in strategy, benefits unrealized. So the reasons we embarked on the program, they're not being fulfilled. And lastly, changes in environments. The abstract model the program was driving towards, those assumptions weren't true. So the reasons we wanted to set these up was just to set that mental picture of this isn't just an IT issue. We need to think more broadly. And really, when you think about who can apply that broader perspective of a program, that's where we look to governance groups like yourselves to think more broadly about the success of programs and what it means to CalSTRS. So as Kristen introduced, we're sharing with you a risk framework. And this is our attempt to show you that broader perspective. As Barbara indicated, it's about business outcomes, enterprise risk. So you're not seeing up here very technical terms. I started my career as a software engineer, so if you'd like to get into that kind of area, I'd love it. But that's not what we're showing to you. This risk framework is driven by business outcomes. So I'll talk through these 5. And as was indicated earlier, we've got a set of questions we've given to you as ideas for questions the board can ask around these areas. So I'll go from the top to the bottom. Strategic outcomes. The reason we invested in this program, we set aside significant amounts of money, time, internal resources. It was for reasons. So how do we track that we're still going towards that? There are any number of programs which put their blinkers on, got through their tactical day-to-day activities, and several months, several years later, produced something, but it didn't actually match up with the reason we funded this in the first case. So we'll talk more about this in a second, but that's that strategic level. The second is probably the most intuitive, which is program delivery outcomes. We are setting up a temporary organization for a period of time and we're funding them. So we want to make sure they're making appropriate use of that funding, that they're doing it in a disciplined manner, on time, on budget, to quality. So some of the topics here are around producing reports for you guys to see progress, that transparency. that they're taking an approach which makes sense and has the right calibration for risk and outcomes. And it also includes the people, the teams, including your vendors, and if they're working effectively. So you can think a bit about this as like a time-bound business unit and how effective that group is. That third level, business outcomes. And I think Barbara made this point really well before. At the end of this project, you will have new business processes, new teams working together using the system to provide those services to your stakeholders. And so if you think about, yes, a project with all the schedules and dashboard reports might seem a little foreign, at the end of this, you have something which is part of your business. And so thinking about how we're delivering those business outcomes is this third level. Business processes, organizational change management that Kristen will speak about in some detail in a few seconds. And finally, who's going to, when we transition this into production, who's going to monitor, support, and run these processes and systems? Fourth level, technology outcomes. This might be more intuitive, that we'll have a system. It'll have application, functionality, infrastructure in terms of performance, reliability, and data in terms of data reliability, integrity, security. And the very last one is perhaps the most overlooked area, which is controls outcomes. It's very easy to forget about controls and just produce a functioning system. But if we're not thinking about security, I think just about every day front page news will be some sort of security breach and the reputational impacts. If you think about controls, think about in the context of Sarbanes-Oxley type requirements, these systems are an opportunity to put those internal controls in place in a lean and efficient and complete manner, rather than having to rely on manual processes later. And finally, regulatory compliance and legal compliance. There are many aspects of a program which need to consider this, but it's not something that often an IT vendor will think about on a day-to-day basis. So we wanted to give you this broad picture. We are going to tap into a couple of these items and get very specific to try and provide you some insight into 1, 2, or 3 of these areas. But we wanted to share this with you because when you are thinking to yourself, are we at risk? Is this program healthy? If you are thinking about this broad perspective, then you have the best opportunity to identify those concerns early. The flip side to that, if the reporting you're seeing, the information being brought to you, does not cover all these areas, then we have a concern. Because if you're not being informed about one of these boxes or one of these rows, that is a blind spot and a potential risk.
We just stop. We have a question from our members. Mr. Rosensteel, Paul.
So I think this is a great framework, but the problem that I have, and I think we've all had sitting up here, you know, talking about this project now for many years, is I don't know what question to ask about any of these things. I mean, it all makes sense, but I don't understand enough of the details to ask a question to get at the heart of whether, you know, any of these 15 boxes is being addressed well. So I'm hoping that maybe as you talk a little bit more, you'll give us some sense about what it is that we should be doing. What questions should we be asking? We've got an item on the agenda tomorrow about the status of the project. What questions should we be asking?
Thank you very much for that question.
Because I have no idea what to tell the staff to do. I have no ability to say, gee, you didn't do X, Y, Z, right. Because I'm not, you know, we're governance. We're not
Absolutely.
Experts. So how do we ask questions and ask questions that then bring about change if change is needed?
And I think, Paul, this presentation is really tailored to that very concern. So then we'll have Michael respond, but we'll have other questions by my colleagues as well.
So thank you for the question. And it's almost a perfect segue to the next slide. And I'd also bring your attention, the later slides in this deck are specific questions grouped by these 5 areas, and also the back page. Thank you.
Michael, hold on. Let me take all the questions in case your
absolutely.
presentation can incorporate the concerns raised, okay? Ms. Vargas, Norris.
I guess my question was around where within these focus areas would we have sort of what the plan is if something doesn't work out, right? So where does your crisis management piece or rapid response, and who are the people who have this information so that we are aware of it, and when does it come up to the board, and when do those red flags actually show up? I think for me it would be interesting to see where that falls into these focus areas, because there is that 40+% that it may work, but if it doesn't, then what happens?
Okay, we'll encompass that in your remarks as well. Sharon?
Can you, Mike, can you go back to that last slide? Because I thought that was shocking, first of all. And I think the question, because we have certainly seen issues with other colleagues, other systems having these issues, and that number is a really high number. And to me, I guess one of the questions I have is, I don't know how many years this data is based on, but sort of since we can identify some of those issues that the reasons for failure, the reasons for project delay, why aren't these projects improving in terms of performance? So I guess that's a question for me. So are we not learning? Are we so bureaucratic that we just can't adapt to change? So that's one question I have, because I certainly, it's no secret we've had challenges here, and I'm not surprised by that because I understand there's a history of these challenges. I guess I would love for our project to not have as many challenges, right? That's our hope. And so I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, as to why that number is still so high, and maybe some of the reasons why that's not the case. And then a couple other things stuck out to me. The issue around benefits unrealized, that one sticks out to me because, I hang out with our members a lot, and to me, these benefits have to be realized, right? That's the whole point of doing this, is to make sure our members understand and there's clarity. And then change of environment also, I just think technology changes so fast, right? So this is an IT project, and I think about my phone and how much it's changed in a year, let alone 5 or 10 years. And this project is how many years? But how many years projected? 5, 6 years project. A lot changes in that time in IT. And so I think those are 2 areas that to me feel like I want to make sure we get right, because the whole point of doing this is for our members to, to get what they were promised and what they've earned in their retirement, but also that we're the latest, we're the cutting edge of IT. Why spend all this money if it's not really going to last us a long period of time? So.
Great.
Great. We have one more question, but I have a question with regard to this slide. The 68% of IT projects, is that across all sectors, public and private? Okay. And I guess what I would say about that is that there's always heightened scrutiny of failed projects in the public sector, obviously,
Right.
because they are either taxpayer funded or, in this case, with member contributions as well. So, okay. Harry. Whoops. Would you buzz in again? I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the questions, and as I looked through the slides in advance, I really, that stood out to me. Those were really great questions. But as was stated by my colleague, Mr. Rosenstiel, for me, I feel somewhat inadequate around this entire project, because it's like a foreign language to me, right? Why we're doing it, the cost of it, the time, the resources, the risk of not doing it. So it's almost as if I feel as if I'm climbing up this mountain, and it's just of trying to grasp the magnitude of the project, the cost associated with it, the time associated with it, the benefits of doing it versus the risks of not doing it. I don't know if I'll ever fully be smart enough to understand the details of software, and so I just accept that about myself. I don't need to. But what I do need to have is some oversight over the project. And what I'm wrestling with, and I don't know if any of my colleagues are wrestling with the same issue, is what's the appropriate level of oversight? What is the frequency of the reports that we've been receiving? Is it at the right pace? Should there be additional oversight? If so, what would that look like? So that's kind of what I'm been wrestling with, would be, are we getting enough reports? Are they timely? What's the cost of continuing at the pace we're doing this relative to our oversight? What would it look like differently? And I think that's probably, those are questions that will also be raised tomorrow at the board level when the item's raised. Because I don't want to get into the weeds of the project, but I don't want to be so far removed from it that those 4 reasons for failure rests on the shoulders of the people that are around the dais, because it's ultimately our responsibility to oversee that this is done and implemented by the staff and the consultants, and people are working really hard. So I'll leave it with that.
Great, thank you.
Certainly appreciate those questions. The 3 of us, in preparation for this, were hoping, and as Barbara indicated, they would be interactive. Maybe we got more than we were hoping for, but really appreciate it, and please continue. So I took down 4 major questions. The first, what questions should we be asking? The second, around crisis management, what happens if things go wrong? The third, what's some of the background to these failure stats? And the fourth, the board role versus the oversight groups, how do they fit together? How do you know how to calibrate your role in comparison to those? So I think the first and the fourth point we will cover in 2 slides' time, where we'll show all these pieces to the puzzle fitting together, and I'll try and cover off those specific questions. In terms of the escalation, the crisis management, we can certainly talk around how the information flows up in that same time. But Barbara, maybe a good opportunity for you to talk about that, what if, and what the board does in those circumstances. But if I tactically just cover that third question straight away, we've got this slide.
Let's do that, and then we'll keep moving through the presentation.
Okay, thanks. So why? The question was, why aren't these success rates increasing over time with IT projects? And I should provide some sort of caveat that every situation is unique, but we certainly see some consistent themes. One would be the inherent nature of an IT project. And when we look at creating something new in a short, time-bound, 18-month, 3-year, 6-year time, it's actually a fairly constrained period of time to create something new. And I think, and you're seeing that poor estimates, people fail to factor in that level of inherent uncertainty. So if you think about doing something for the very first time, creating a system of this magnitude for this base of transactions, you may think to yourself, if we think there is this inherent failure rate, you would factor that in to your schedules. And you might say, I'm applying a 50% confidence level to this schedule. Therefore, my best guess of how long it takes, I'm going to double it to factor in that risk. That would be the textbook way of doing it. But the commercial realities is a vendor who comes to the table with that high contingency plan may lose the bidding process, may also have natural pushback to say, hey, we can't spend 10 years on this. Skinny it down. So I think that interplay, unfortunately, we're our own worst enemies in that regard. So that's that estimate point and the inherent nature. The good side is there are techniques emerging that de-risk programs. So using packaged software where the majority of the code already exists and you're configuring, not writing new code. That is a way of reducing that risk of failure. You may have heard of Agile as a software development body of practice. And that is shown to have higher success rates than the classic waterfall where you write all your requirements up front then you design, then you build. So that's a technique which has helped with some of these areas because you're getting real-time feedback. And so if you think about some of these reasons for failure, if you're getting continuous feedback, you can change course with the changing dynamics. So I guess, Ms. Hendricks, that's some of the reasons and some of the potential solutions.
Yes, Sharon?
Just, these mics are kind of echoing on. What you identified about the poor estimates piece, because, I work with bond issues with building, colleges and things like that. That seems like an inherent issue, right? Because people want to get the bid, so I don't see that either going, it seems like a systemic issue, and unless we solve that somehow, that seems like that's just going to be a factor that plagues these IT projects. Does that make sense? Because people overpromise and underdeliver, or they try and, give you a lowball figure, but at the end of the day, you're in the project, and it's like, oh, it's going to cost us.
So a cute phrase is projects don't fail at the end, they fail at the beginning. And so if we set off with unrealistic expectations, if we pick the wrong, and I'm not suggesting this is the case here, but if we pick the wrong solution, the wrong priorities, then we're always destined for these kind of stats. And so if you took a step back, obviously we have a large significant program now, but the other upstream implications come in portfolio management, picking the right initiatives, IT architecture and architectural roadmaps. Where are we trying to go? Are we trying to be best of breed? Are we trying to pick lower risk solutions? Some of those IT strategic questions are setting the foundation that projects sit on. So I think that's going upstream may get to the root cause.
Mike, we have one more question. Paul?
Yeah, so, just following on what Sharon was asking about, over-promising and under-delivering, and the obvious desire that we on this side have to contract with somebody who can promise to do something quickly and at a low price. But what you're saying is that almost never works. I mean, that's a major reason why there are all of these delays. And so it comes to then we can't blame the contractor for failing to perform under an unrealistic contract. We have to say, well, staff was working too hard to get a contract that looked attractive but was not realistic, or we didn't ask the question, is this really enough money? That's not what we normally want to do, right? We don't normally want to say, are you sure we shouldn't be spending more on this project? The reality, of course, is we're going to be ending up on this project spending a lot more. So you say the problem is at the beginning. I think we have to have a way to get comfortable to say the important thing is a contract that's going to work with a vendor that's going to work, not one that looks good because it sounds like it's going to deliver a great project in a really short period of time with very little money.
I would agree with that conclusion. I was perhaps a little flippant in saying this is inherent. There are certainly vendors with higher success rates, and certainly I think your point at the end around picking a solution, a strategy, a vendor who may not be the cheapest or with the most rosy of promises, I think that's a really, really good point.
May I add?
Please.
Just in thinking about this and from a public sector perspective as well, and the context in which you guys are currently operating, the volume is so significant in terms of the services and what you're providing to your members. And so I do commend the team and the vendor partnership for taking on something that is actually quite new and quite significant. And so you guys are actually leading in this space. So I think that's also another complicating and somewhat complex factor that's included in part of this discussion.
Leading in what way?
Given just the large scale of your pension system, the largest in the country in terms of teachers, and looking at the systems that are in place as a commercial off-the-shelf product, which you guys are currently putting in place, that's never been done. And so you are leading the pack. And so there are some learnings that are taking place. And so you guys are actually kind of at the forefront when thinking about this.
Can I follow? I'm not sure I understand that. I mean, there have been, dozens, if not hundreds of large-scale IT projects that have been put into place. And I think what you're hearing up here is a little bit surprised that 68% of IT projects fail. Why is there not any learning that's being done from those so that that number would reasonably go down over time? Because what you're telling us is we shouldn't have expected anything but failure in this. That's what I hear you just telling me.
Apologies if that's what was perceived, but every organization is unique, and I would just say you guys are incredibly unique, and you're putting in place a very large system across a very significant member base. And so there are unique factors related to the implementation specific to CalSTRS that could not necessarily have been anticipated from some of these other implementations. I do commend the team for going out and looking across at other implementations, looking from, different somewhat quasi-similar sized organizations to look at best practices. However, there is some first steps that are being taken from the team. So there are some initial learnings and discovery that's happening. So part of what we're seeing is not only, across the board, there are some people challenges, there are some specific technical challenges when thinking about the methodology, and I'll talk through that a little bit, and where you guys are currently in the process of the system implementation. But just wanted to recognize just the sheer volume and the breadth of services you guys provide allows you to stand out.
And I guess I would just add to that. I mean, I think the goal of that slide is to say and to recognize, and I know we spent a lot of time on it, that these system implementations are difficult. There's a lot of challenges. There are a lot of risks. And you at CalSTRS are not alone in going through that process. And I think the various reasons are highlighted because each is unique to each organization and each system. But I think, the goal of putting the slide in here was not to detract from the great work that you have all done, but from the fact that it is a reality when you put in such a significant and complex system. And so be aware that you're going to go through challenges just like every other organization. And I think that ties a bit to the question on comfort level at a board. I know in my board work, it wasn't long ago, 5 years, and I know even when I spoke to your board in June, cybersecurity had the same feeling. Every organization I went to, there wasn't a board member that was comfortable with the risk of cybersecurity. And over a period of time, boards have become, I'm not going to use the word comfortable, but they have become more knowledgeable. They have become more understanding of the background of the topic and able to ask those questions. And so I bring that up from a standpoint of this is not an area that maybe the board itself is as comfortable with. Financial performance is something you guys deal with on a very regular basis. There's, standard reporting items that you're more comfortable with. But with your board duty and your backgrounds, and the beauty of a board is bringing different perspectives, is the ability to ask questions. And your role is to make certain that the process is in place, that it's working effectively, that red flags are being raised, and those red flags behind there are being dove into so that you understand where the real risks are and how they're being looked. And those are the high-level risks, the significant risk. And so I bring that up from a comfort level that this topic is no different than what I saw cybersecurity not long ago. So I think each board, has these topics that aren't familiar that get on the board's agenda, and you have to kind of work your way through them. So I do want to go ahead. I know you had a question.
I wanted to say that I think the difference, I'm like getting away from my mic here. I think the difference I feel as a board member is we've never, at least in my tenure on the board, have taken on a project of this scope, of this cost. And to Harry's point, the complexity in an arena that if it was member benefit, if it was stuff I understood a little bit better, then, but when it's an area that I think most of us on the board feel like, our IT expertise is, I can work my iPhone and check my email, but just it's a different, the technical and the scope and the cost. I think those are all things that are different that stand out as unique in this project. And so I think that's why I think we've been feeling, at least I've been feeling for the last couple of years, we get reports which are helpful. It's certainly, I think you're feeling from us that it doesn't quite satisfy the sense of like, we're providing great oversight on this project. And I want to get to a comfort level where I feel like we are doing our fiduciary duty, providing that oversight. And so it's figuring out tools and ideas, which I'm sure you'll get to provide that comfort level, at least to this board member, that we're providing that kind of oversight, not getting in the weeds, but providing enough oversight that we have a comfort level that we're addressing some of these issues.
So I think we should kind of keep moving forward, because hopefully no, these are excellent questions, and we're here for you. So we appreciate the questions, and I know there are still a couple outstanding that hopefully we'll get to as we go through the balance of the presentation and sort of share some of that deeper insights that we can to maybe give you some tools to help ask those right questions and bring that level of comfort.
So a couple of the questions related to the board's role versus the other people who covers these risk areas, and how is that information shared? So this slide, number 7, you're seeing that same 5 areas of risk model, those horizontal outcomes. And what we've overlaid here is the various groups who typically manage those risks on a day-to-day basis. So they're those colorful jigsaw pieces. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read off every single one, but I'm sure the visual gives you the takeaway, which is, my goodness, that's a large number of groups who all need to click seamlessly. Gaps between those groups, or indeed missing pieces, or pieces which aren't fulfilling their role effectively, is when the risks truly come through. That second dimension you're seeing on the right-hand side is what we would refer to as a second line of defense. So teams who are then scrutinizing the work of the colorful pieces and seeing if there's gaps, seeing if there's quality concerns. And I'm aware on this program you have an IPOC vendor who would be focusing largely on the strategic outcomes, program delivery outcomes. IV&V looking at those products, so the business and technology outcomes. And then my assumption is an internal audit group or a risk and regulatory group would be looking at those controls outcomes. So I think, Mr. Rosenstein, there's a question around what does the board ask? So we've got 3 questions on the right-hand side. The first one is, how are we comfortable that each of these roles, each of these topics is covered? Both the colorful, the first level, and then also that second line. So that would be a fundamental question I would want to make sure. To your point, you don't need to be an expert then. You don't need to know the nuances of data conversion, only that we have someone primarily responsible for data conversion and secondarily doing a quality check, perhaps your IV&V vendor. So that's board question number 1. Board question number 2 is to say, okay, we may have someone contracted for that role. How are we confident those teams have the right skills, the right expertise, the right experience? So that's, again, to go back to a similar theme, not necessarily the cheapest or the loftiest promise, but really looking at the quality of all of those teams and their performance in those roles. So that's the second board question. Thirdly, is the board confident that teams are getting to the right depth? Now, what do we mean by that? If I take one example, which is a project schedule, which outlines all the tasks between here and go live, and indeed maybe the months beyond. A very superficial level of inquiry would be, do we have a project schedule? That would be a contractual compliance tick. Another level of detail beyond that would be, is that technically sound? So do all those tasks have a resource, a person that applied to it? Do they all flow together? The more significant question is it the right schedule? Are we taking the right approach? Have we de-risked the schedule? Now, to the point, the question before, I'm not expecting this board to be able to diagnose if it's the right schedule or the right approach. But certainly by asking that question and being able to get that response from the team responsible, from your second line of defense, and I guess applying a bit of a sniff test to, are you getting the comfort that they are indeed the right schedule, the right approach? So that's the third key topic for this board is, are you getting the right depth from those teams?
And I think where we're going to go now is diving into some of those more specific areas that you're focused on right now in the overall project. So maybe, Kristen, we will dive a little bit deeper there and circle to some of those questions.
Sure, thanks, Barbara. So we're going to go through a couple of components, so some of those squares within that framework. And so the way that we've set these up just for orientation is on the left-hand side, we're talking about some key best practices and pulling forward our experience in the public sector. And then on the right-hand side are specific questions that are complementary to the ones that you see on the back page of that booklet. So Barbara spoke earlier around the strategy alignment. And so ensuring that the board has oversight in terms of those large projects that have a direct impact or direct alignment and link to the strategy and the strategic plan, which this one does, which we've talked about. So when thinking about that, I would also think about the holistic picture around this project, the impact to all of the stakeholders and our members. And so when thinking about the actual success and the progress of this project, I would think about it from that member perspective in terms of what they're going to get and making sure that you guys are guarding that product essentially. So that's an easy way to think about the types of questions and ensuring that this project is essentially ticking the box on all of the intended outcomes of the project. So every project typically has specific performance indicators that are essentially the guardrails. These are the targets that we want to hit. Those are questions that I would continually bring up as a board member throughout the duration of this project. Are we achieving the initial objectives that we set out as part of this project? Was it looking for ensuring that we're future-proofing, for instance, with the technology, so we can adjust and be agile as we move forward and grow and expand, for instance, or provide different services? So those are some key questions and some considerations to think about. So on the right-hand side, there are some questions there, and I think that last one around looking at guarding and mitigating risks, that is a critical component to any board, and especially at the board level where you are the guardians for this organization, and reputational risk in the public sector is critical. We are at the top of mind for a number of individuals across the board, including our great teachers here in California. But that is important for you guys to be informed enough to make decisions that are in line with the strategic direction for the organization. So that's the alignment on strategy. So I'm going to keep moving through these, but again, I would say reference that booklet in the back for more detail. So in terms of program management, as Mike was mentioning, this is a significant program. And so you have a number of different individuals and groups that are part of the tiered governance that you guys have in place for this program. So the idea is that as we're going through, there are checks and balances. And we have some oversight across a number of different areas. And so with any typical fundamental program, we have the program triangle, if you will, right? So scope, schedule, and budget. If one of those moves, the others are affected. And so that's what we're seeing right now, is we have some areas that are expanding our scope, and so therefore it's affecting our schedule and going to affect our budget. And so there's always going to be a follow-on effect. And so with best practices, as Mike was mentioning, with schedules and so forth, ensuring that we have key milestones in place. What is the critical path? Are we following that? Is that in alignment with the intended outcomes initially set up for the program? And so asking those types of questions and making sure that we're seeing how we're following along through the project progression is really critical. And I would also note that because we have so many individuals involved and vendors and stakeholders, it's really important that we're focusing on our resource management, not just internally, but externally. And so I would recommend some healthy challenging around the partnering and ensuring that we all are focused on the end goal and we're all aligned on what that end goal is. So that's a continual conversation, like with any sort of partnership in the vendor community, and so that's something that I would make sure that we're thinking about throughout the process. So I'm going to skip to the next slide, which shows some visuals. And so we talked about this a little bit earlier. You guys were asking about what reports are included and what's the frequency and so forth. And so one thing that I would think about is there's a little bit of an art and a science to this from what I've seen across other public sector organizations. You see traditional reporting, you see different heat maps. There's a lot of, traffic light reporting where it's showing indications if we're going in the red. As a board member and as a top-level executive guiding this organization, I would want to understand a little bit more in a visual format. I'm a visual learner. I would ask for that because you don't just have to have written reports in order to provide you the detail that you might need. There's a variety of ways that you can do that. But I think bottom line, you're trying to understand what's going on, why is it happening, and ultimately, what does it mean for our consumer and for our beneficiaries? And then what will happen if we don't do anything about it? So I would ask all of those questions whenever you're provided some interesting information or insights, because ultimately it should lead to a decision on behalf of the board. You are here to help guide the organization and make decisions, and so the information should help build a story in order for you guys to make your next decision related to this large program that's going through.
Kristen, I was just going to add to that. I've seen a practice that I know a board that's going through a system implementation has done that I think kind of sort of highlights that in a way. So, as Kristen said, oftentimes there's a traffic light that's presented to the board, red, yellow, green. And when you get a red, what does that mean? So I've seen where board members have pushed back to create the translation of what does that red flag mean to the board. And so I've seen where a board member would say, you need to, with that red flag, identify for me, what does that mean to our organization? What does that mean to our customer? What does that mean to our other stakeholders? And so if you have a red flag in an area of the system implementation, does that red flag mean that a person won't be able to get their funds? That's a significant red flag. And I've even seen where organizations have color-coded those red flags once you drill down to what they mean at an organization. If it's that your customers can't get their money, that's something that you can't move forward with. That has to be addressed. If the red flag is that somebody, can't look and get their information from a year ago as a customer, maybe that's something that in 15 days and 30, it can be fixed and the customer can move forward with it. And it's maybe not as big of a risk to you. But I think as a board, unless you're asking them to drill down to create that translation for you on what that risk means to your key constituencies, and then potentially even red flag those so you really know where the impact is and what that impact is can be helpful.
That's helpful. Thank you, Barbara. And I would also just point out that the information that you guys are being provided is helpful to inform you so that you can best represent CalSTRS to the external community as well. So I would think about it from that perspective in addition. So moving beyond the program management functions, I wanted to highlight an area that's actually really important and somewhat of a transition in the public sector space, and that's around the actual delivery approach that we employ when we're actually implementing these systems. So there are, I would say, two primary schools of thought. There are others that are out there, but the two primary are around a traditional waterfall approach that Mike mentioned. So where we go through, we develop and we plan what we want as part of this system, we have our requirements, then we hit a stage gate, and then we move to the next stage, and we continue that process throughout. And so it's very methodical, but it can be time intensive, and it also doesn't necessarily allow you to see or feel or touch what you're developing until later in the process. And so therefore, if there is a change or you're starting to see something come to life that isn't quite what was intended, it takes a bit of time to go back and do some rework or reorient. And so that's where we often see some projects have a bit of a pause. Another alternative is this agile method, which is essentially an iterative process. And that's where you're going through, you're actually developing the requirements and designing and developing the system and essentially checking it in real time. And that's that real-time feedback that Mike was talking about. Interestingly, the state of California is primarily focusing on using agile development. This is a way that they're trying to reduce the risk when they're going through these system implementations and not necessarily being locked into a particular solution, vendor set, and they're trying to spread that out across. So This is a shift I've seen across a number of different states and agencies, but it's something that is going to take a little bit of time because it's going to be a big shift for people in terms of how we code and how we actually address projects. So big picture, you guys have an understanding of where we're at in the process through the waterfall approach. This program is going through the development and testing stages right now. And, I commend the team as they've seen some challenges, they've paused because they've recognized that what they intended initially was not what they're seeing or what has now come forward with the development of the system. So they took a pause, they did the fit gap analysis, which you guys will hear more about as a result of the later presentations. But that is best practice, and that is what you would want the team to do. So I definitely commend them for taking a pause, ensuring that we're achieving those initial requirements and outcomes that were expected. So I just wanted to highlight that because as we think about public sector in general, regardless of what delivery approach, there's always going to be more risk associated with our projects. We are political by nature. You all know this. There's a lot of folks who are watching this project, watching your organization every day, and inherently it touches a lot of people and a lot of stakeholders. So just knowing that we're dealing with public funds, understandably, these are trust assets, but it's still being good stewards of those public dollars. So it's critical. So with that, thinking about some board considerations, some questions, understanding what are the risks associated with the methodology that we're pursuing right now? Are we engaging, are we getting the good information about those risks on those reports in a way that makes sense? And we're asking those questions, why? How is this impacting our end beneficiary? And then making sure that there aren't any surprises, I think, both for you guys and also all of the stakeholders who are currently involved. So I hope that helps provide a little bit of detail at a high level around the types of systems, the type of, essentially the methodology that we choose, and then the inherent risks that are associated. So I'm going to leave the best for last, and that is essentially the people component. That is always, I think, and what we've seen, the most challenging component to any sort of system that is developed. You can build any great system, but if people don't know how to use it or don't want to use it, it will fail. And so this is a critical component. This is my area of expertise, and I will say that your team is currently using an ADCAR methodology. It's essentially used by ProSci, which is a way to think through, and it's in a simple way, I would say, to think through change management. It's quite helpful, and I see a lot of public sector entities use it because it's a way to explain it. ADCAR is just an acronym, and you see that diagram there on the slide. It's providing awareness, ensuring that there's desire on behalf of the individual who is going through this change, providing the knowledge for them in terms of the delta from previous to future, ensuring that they have the ability, which as a learning organization, that's what we're always testing, right? We provide them that knowledge, but do they actually know how to use this? And then we're reinforcing. So it doesn't just stop from the training or the teaching, it's the actual reinforcement of that change. So the ADCAR model is helpful. What I've seen and what I added the best practices was that I would certainly recommend that you think about taking a deep dive, especially on large, complex projects. There's a lot of tools at the high level with ADCAR that's helpful, but you have so many stakeholders, you have so many changes as a result of this program. Take a deep dive on your stakeholder assessment, the readiness assessment, how ready are people for this change, and making sure that you're taking that information, then tailoring how you're engaging, how you're training, and then how you're reinforcing ultimately this change with the system. So there are some questions off to the side that you guys can think about. It's a lot around the communication. How are we communicating internally? How are we preparing our own people and for this change, as well as externally, making sure that we're managing those messages and those expectations. And then looking at, what is our past experience? Organizations sometimes have scars, and so we have to be aware of what we've experienced in the past and also what the public has experienced in the past, and making sure that we have that holistic understanding and therefore can carry that forward in our messaging and our training and engagement approach. Lastly, I would just tick down to that fourth consideration, we need to think about it in terms of a long-term change. How are we really making this change stick? So when we put the system in place, how are we ensuring that people know how to use the system from day one, but also from a year, 2 years from now, as we make tweaks here and there? So I think about it in a more holistic and long-term approach. So those are the items that we wanted to call out, because we felt that those were timely based on where we're at in the program, and thought that that might be helpful to add some best practices from public sector, as well as some considerations for the board to choose.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We do have some questions. Let me just try to frame this a little bit. I get the sense this has been a little torturous for some of my colleagues in the committee, but I will say that at the very basic level, I think the point of this is just to elevate our risk awareness around large-scale projects like the one that we're undertaking. And also, I think for me, what's important is also the relationship of our oversight role with our staff and the support we can lend to ensuring the success of the project, the guidance we can lend to them. I understand there are different levels of proficiency or maybe understanding or desire to understand kind of the elements of the project, and I personally have been dealing with more than my share of projects, but another way to get on top of this might be, if it gives you some comfort, is to think about establishing a subcommittee of this committee to really do the deep dive, and I certainly am willing to be a part of that, but this is really important. I mean, we see a lot of attention focused on this, particularly in the public sector. At the end of the day, this is really about how we have a system that really supports the delivery of benefits to our customers, to our members. And we want to be sure that with respect to the scope, if it should change over time, certainly the schedule and the budget, that we are asking all the right questions and being sure that we are keeping this project on track. The other good news is that there are a lot of resources available to us. We're not going about this alone. So I know the California Department of Technology is very much hands-on now with providing just consultations with respect to how to help departments and state entities stay on track. There is more of an employment, as was mentioned, about the agile approach to these projects. We have taken an approach, but and neither is one over the other. We are where we're at, and I think there are ways to look at how we keep this project on track. Also, I would say that, originally I was thinking about bringing all the control agencies in to talk about, how state IT works, because this is really a part of the rigidity of the whole IT process in California as a state government. There may be room for conversation for that later. I didn't think that was a good starting point. Our focus really should be on our project, and I hope this at least gave a pretty fundamental level of context in terms of the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about. But if we leave with anything today, I hope it's just the idea that we're just more aware that these projects do present risks and that we do have a responsibility for a pretty basic oversight function over it. With that, Paul, you have a question?
Thank you. Yeah, this was very, very interesting. And I'm still not sure I know what your message is. I think we go into this project, we fully expected that it was going to go well, that there weren't going to be delays and cost overruns of any significance. I'm not sure I'm hearing from you that was a reasonable expectation, that you keep describing this as very unique, we're doing something very different. And so maybe our expectations were too high. Maybe we should be going into this expecting problems. I don't accept that. It seems to me that it is in our control. It may have required, in other words, if it's going to cost us 40% more than we originally thought, we would have been in much better shape just to acknowledge that up front and, add 40% to the budget 3 years ago rather than tomorrow. But I'm getting the sense that you're suggesting we might not have even known it then. So the problem that I'm having is a list of questions is great, but I don't know what to do with the answers. right? I don't know what we do with the answers. I don't know how we get change to happen with the answers. I don't know how to evaluate the answers because the people who are answering the questions know a whole lot more than I do. So I'm still looking for the roadmap going forward, starting tomorrow on the assumption we approve the modifications to the plan. I'm still looking for what do we do? Because I mean, it seems like, you know, this board hasn't lived up to our own expectations on this project. The staff hasn't lived up to our expectations on this project. The contractors haven't lived up to our expectations on this project. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just stating what I think you have to draw as a conclusion from the place we're at. And if we approve those changes tomorrow, how do we change what we do up here on oversight? And I'm still completely unclear what that is.
And that's a very good question. I mean, I understand and I have empathy for understanding how complex this is. And I think that's part of what our message was. It's complex. There are changes that go on. You cannot predict from the beginning to the end exactly what's going to happen as any large, long-term project changes. And so when I think about that, and I'll let my colleagues chime in here and what the board questions to be asked. And we gave you some questions, and obviously you need to adapt those to your situation. But what I find helpful as a board member is, one, making certain that the information I get is in plain English to me. And that is the role of a board. Whether it's a chief information officer speaking to the board, it should not be in any type of, acronyms or in a language that the board is not familiar with. So one is putting that into plain English, and I start with that as a basis. The second is adding on to the questions. When somebody says, here's something that's going on with the project, the board should say, and what is the implication of that to us? What does that mean? And someone should be able to explain that to the board level. And then asking the question, so what are you worried about? The board can ask, so what do you worry about with that as an aspect of the project? What risk does that bring? What keeps you up at night? Those can be, and I say that in a basic question, adding on to the end of a question, and so what happens next? What does that mean next? The board can be able to, you don't have all the answers, but you can ask those questions to get to a level where you can get a better understanding. You're never going to be the IT expert. I understand that, and I don't think that's your role, but it's enough to add on to those questions and ask those individuals to translate the information into what that means to the strategic goals of the system implementation and what our objectives are. Where is there a match and where is there a mismatch? And what does that mean from a key risk, and how have we mitigated that risk? And so that's where I see the board adding the benefit by asking and layering on those questions to make that translation happen.
And I can make that quite tactical for you. I think you're looking for give me something I can do and then impact change. Because I think what Barbara's talking about is the key distinction here. I think the way you expressed it as we had expectations, it was reasonable for us to think they were going to be met. And now, if they've not been met, it's a very binary distinction. And you've heard from us these failure rates, which would indicate that binary bad option was always going to happen. I think a rethinking of that is required. It's a question of risk level and risk tolerance. So embarking on a program like this has inherent risk, and you need to do a careful assessment of whether that's within your tolerance or not, and then whether the program continues within that tolerance or not. So I would say early and frequently throughout, you want a risk assessment of, and it's based on that same framework you saw before. What are the risks to those outcomes? And is it within your comfort level? I would say that's the data that could come to this group, and to Barbara's point, you can then say, okay, you've raised a risk, but so what? What's the impact to us? What should we do to mitigate that risk? Or are we comfortable that's within our risk appetite? I think that brings information to you in language you can understand and make those calls on.
That's great, Mike. I appreciate that. That helped me, just that last few minutes, because I share Paul's high expectations for our staff and for how, I did walk into this expecting some challenges just because I hang out in California and read the paper. So I just feel like I agree that our standards should be different than everybody else, but I also feel like realistically, it's a big project and there's a lot of moving parts. And so I'm not surprised by some of the challenges we're facing. Again, I guess I feel like your language around a level of risk and the questions helps me have more comfort, because I feel like I want our project to be the best project. I want it to, come in on time, meet budget, but more importantly, I want it to meet the needs for our members. At the end of the day, I want the output to be excellent. And so thank you. And I did want to ask just technically, Kristen, with the questions that were on the PowerPoint, the last couple of slides you went through, those are different questions than the ones that are here, or at least when I looked through them and I kind of looked back and forth, they were a bit different. And I would love it if our staff or someone could call those questions. I see Ashish nodding his head, so he's all over it. But if we could somehow take that information from those slides and the questions are on the side that are different than the ones provided here and provide that, at least to me, if other board members want that as well, that would help me just to kind of have in my Penson solution file.
Absolutely.
That'd be great. So, and I did just want to say, and I think this item should be, precedential, I guess, from our appeals committee in terms of the way that you communicated to us as a board. I'm floored by, you get an A+ in my class in terms of, we ask people who come to speak to us, we ask them to be concise, give us time to talk, focus on us and not just everybody else in the world. And I feel like your presentation today really hit the mark in terms of just presenting to us as a board. So I just want to thank you for that, because we want to make our time here useful. And so I really appreciate, Betty, your part in presenting this information, because I think it's really timely given the item that we're looking at tomorrow. The only other suggestion I'd have, Betty, with this idea of maybe a subcommittee is, I know I would like this, and maybe other board members would like this. I would love to sit down, and I think Karen kind of already did this. You're ahead of us on this, but it might be helpful to have a time where all the board members who are interested to be able to sit with Cassandra and staff in the building at a different time than a board meeting. And I'd love to walk through, okay, what did our members see back in start, or back 10, 15 years ago? What are our members seeing now? And then what do we expect our members to be able to see at the end of this project? And if there's a way we can model but I know for me, just as a kinesthetic learner too, it might be helpful to get tangible, eyes and hands-on, how the process works. And so that will help inform, at least for me, I think that would be helpful. So if that's something we can help make happen in a couple of hours or half a day here.
Absolutely. And you raised a point, Sharon. I will just say from my own experience, kind of two key takeaways in terms of projects that I've been associated with that have not met expectations that rang out were, one, lack of executive leadership, and two, I think the need to really just be transparent throughout. So as much as I think your idea is really a great idea, and all of us could benefit from that. But I also would invite, and I know it's time into a really crunched agenda at every meeting, that our members also deserve to know kind of what the expectations are. So I think the more public and transparent we can be, the better. Thank you. Joy?
Thank you. Thank you. And I just agree with Sharon that the information that you provided and the way that you gave it to, those of us on the board who are not technology experts was really helpful. I guess my question is, at least some of the things that you would suggest a board do, I think are things our board has done. In the very beginning of the project, I think we struggled with the type of reporting that we were getting either from the staff or from our consultants. And so we worked to make the reporting something that would be a little bit more visual, something that would really identify key categories of the project to identify where we were on track or off track. I think that when we have received reports about potential trends to yellow or trends to red. We have asked the kinds of questions you've talked about. Where we are in the process hasn't meant that I think those risks would be directly member risks. They were really more risks to budget, to schedule, to scope. So we've asked some of those things, yet here we are. We've gone through, some time where some of those categories were yellow and continue to be yellow, and then now we've got the fit gap that we've done, and we're going to discuss, modification to the project budget schedule. Rather than thinking about what we could have done differently, do you have advice on what we do going forward, given that we have done some of these things? How do we assess or gain confidence that the proposal before us tomorrow and what we see going forward is hitting the mark more than what we've seen so far?
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. And I would think about when we're looking at the kind of flow of a project, you guys are at the point where this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the development of the system comes together. You actually get to see it. And the idea around the board having some exposure in terms of what was originally developed, where you guys are at now, and where you're going forward, that would be excellent insight just to see the transformation of what your members are going to also experience. So given the current point in the project that you are right now and the conversation you'll have soon around the fit gap, my understanding is that the team has done a great job looking at what is a fit, so what's working, what is on track with the requirements, what is a gap, and then therefore with those gaps, they've done, I understand, an exercise around prioritization, which is excellent. So when we have these gaps, it's thinking through, it's a bit of that risk tolerance, but it's also looking at what is a must-have. What do we have to have in the system based on what we expect for our members? What is something that we would like to have that we maybe can incorporate in further releases? And what is something that is new and additive feature that we don't currently have today that we maybe don't need in this current release that you can think about doing later on down the road? And so you're going to see that structure likely come to play. And if you don't, I would ask for it, because ultimately you need to think about, where we thought we would have a system developed meeting certain requirements and where there may be a delta. And so after the development of that system, that's when you're shifting to production and also preparing our people. So I would be thinking in that mode of, okay, now we know what we're expecting in terms of the system to be deployed. How are we deploying this? How are we communicating? How are we training and making sure that we're identifying the unique stakeholder groups that may need different information? So internally, our IT staff, who's going to be working on a different system, our internal benefits staff, who's going to be directly meeting with members and ensuring that they know what to expect and can help them and service them. Our members, all the variety of different members in terms of what we need to make sure that we're providing information out in relation to the system. And I would also think about yourselves as a stakeholder group as well. So thinking about what do you need to know as a board member in order to communicate appropriately around what the public will expect coming forward. So now it's a bit of a transition from pretty technical conversations up until now. There's going to be more of that as you guys finalize through the testing and kind of verify where you're moving forward with certain aspects from the fit gap. And you'll hear a lot more about that. Basically, they're just trying to make sure that the system is being built as it was intended. And so they're doing all the right steps right now. But think about it from now we're shifting to preparing our people for the system. Does that help? Excellent.
If I could just add one idea to that, I think what Kristen was sharing were a couple of significant moments in the remainder of this program where you need to have a point of view. So you refer to the operational readiness, are our people ready? If you were to look at the timeline between here and go live, and you were to pick some of those moments and say, that would be an appropriate time to have someone come to you and talk about a forward-looking risk assessment or readiness assessment. You'll have so many people focusing on the daily activities and getting through the tough work going forward. Inevitably, they focus on the day-to-day activities. So having that longer range forecast and risk assessment is something that would be, I think, a valuable piece of information for you.
Thank you, John. Steve?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I agree with the others in that it was, I think, right on the mark in terms of what we need to know at this level. But I was also taken with the chair's remarks about the potential for a subcommittee. It's been my experience in having sat on a number of boards that a lot of times the full board itself doesn't have the necessary time or expertise to necessarily get to the level of understanding that would be required and appropriate for this type of project. And so I don't know if we're going to move on this, but I would hardly endorse the idea if that there were the idea of a subcommittee to spend more time and to be our proxy, in effect, for between the board and staff and the consultant. That would help, bring to us the understanding that we need. Because it was clear, based on the comments that I heard from my fellow board members, that many of us don't share that or don't have that level of expertise that's needed and without spending some more time intricately on this project, won't be able to develop that. And so I would, as one representative, look to other board members to help educate me in that regard. And so, again, I don't know that the chair was seeking a motion, but I would certainly want to investigate the idea as quickly as we can, the idea of setting up a subcommittee to provide some oversight on this.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Suarez. My thought here was just to put the idea forth. No action yet, but I think there's some intermediate steps that can still help with each of us developing kind of that foundational proficiency about recognizing, just kind of our, and grasping our oversight responsibility a little bit more. And we will bring that item back. Okay, thank you. Nora, please.
Again, thank you for the presentation. I'm still waiting on my crisis conversation, but I'll wait for that one, maybe for tomorrow. But I think for me, I do want to know a little bit more about the best practices, and I think it's sort of the second level of what Ms. Higa asked. And, are we making sure that we are informing our members? When are the right times? Where are the triggers? And I think you started to talk a little bit about that, but I think for me, that's a really important point as we're moving forward, that we see that in our plan in terms of next steps. Because if there are going to be any disruptions, and again, I'm very optimistic about this getting to where it needs to be, but because of the numbers of that don't actually, meet the criteria, don't finish on time, I want to make sure that we are as prepared as we can be. So I want to know if there's additional best practices that we need to know about. What are the best things that we need to do from the governance perspective so that we are meeting those expectations for our members.
To thinking about that shift in mindset.
Could you speak into the mic?
Oh, apologies. I would just think about that shift in mindset from, ensuring that the system from this analysis has taken place and where we're now headed in terms of we're finalizing that testing. And so we're ensuring that now what we're moving forward with the development is working. Excellent. If it's not, ask why and understand, is it a top priority or not? That's where you guys are in this stage right then. And that's best practice in terms of prioritizing where you may have requirements that don't necessarily are working with the system as it's developed. And then, like I said, moving towards that people mindset going forward in terms of, are our people prepared? Are we communicating internally, externally? Are we making sure that folks are ready for this change? And then I would also just take a moment to go back to the beginning in terms of the objectives of the project. Take some time to ensure, are those still valid? Are we still achieving those objectives? That is best practice. And that's where you guys, as guardians of this organization and of this project, ensuring that it's hitting the mark with the strategic priorities of the agency.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nora. Amy, do you want to provide some concluding comments?
I don't have any additional comments, Madam Chair, but thank you for the great presentation. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you to the PwC team. Thank you. We have a lot of food for thought, and I think we'll be working with you to just determine next steps out of all the comments that you heard from the committee members.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time here. Thank you. All right, members, we'll move on to item number 7. This is the review of information requests. Go ahead, Penny.
One request from the committee that staff will take the questions from the slide and provide them to the board.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, item number 8, we have a draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Any comments on that? Yes, Jack, please.
I just wanted to flag one issue, really, Dana, for you. In the board policy manual, we had updated the policy manual to reflect your new meeting schedule for the election of the officers.
Yeah.
So that occurs in May.
Okay.
After the next offsite, in the May meeting, we have the election of the officers. What we haven't updated in the policy manual, which we need to flag for next time you meet, is the appointment of the committees. And Dana, I just thought it'd be good, since we don't have the language in the policy manual exactly, just so we all kind of know what your intention was then for May. Right now, the policy manual references doing it in June like you did in prior years. So I think you had discussed after the May officer election, that would be the first part of the board agenda, and then the elected officers would, at that meeting, request interest in committees. Is that correct? Okay, and then, oh, that's a good point. Very good one. So if that's, just so we can just all kind of acknowledge that's how it would take
Okay.
place in May.
Okay.
And then we need to follow up, just get the policy manual cleaned up at a later date if we could.
Okay.
And actually, now that I notice the point that Dana made humorously there, you may want to, if you want to recognize that new ground rule you have in the committee, that's not exactly how it's stated in the policy manual as
Right.
well, in terms of who participates and who doesn't. So that could be an additional change,
Additional clarification.
if you want to
Absolutely.
state that ground rule.
Yes. Okay. Brian, any thoughts?
I was just gonna ask if you, you're going through the information requests, if that's something you'd like
Yeah,
staff
let's put that, yeah.
to work on, to put onto the agenda, we can do that.
Sure. Please, yeah. Why don't we add that on there?
Okay, so then I'll make the board agenda for May reflect this acknowledgement of how we'll do the committee appointments and the board election.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, terrific, thank you. All right, moving on to, this is now the opportunity for statements from the public. Any member of the public wish to address the committee? Okay, seeing none. Other business by members? Okay, hearing none, this committee is adjourned. Thank you very much.